Hello, welcome everyone. Today on Earth Day, I am Lisa Christensen, President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council, Norwegian Honorary Consul for Alaska, and proud to be the Honorary Commander of the 90th Fighter Squadron, impressive F-22 pilots known as the Dicemen. It's a pleasure to be here today to feature Ambassador Kenneth Braithwaite, who is the former U.S. Ambassador to Norway and 77th Secretary of the Navy, who I had the privilege of meeting on two occasions, actually, in Bodø and Tromsø, Norway, and who we were really looking forward to bringing to Alaska, but completely understand that schedules change. And he's here today to talk with us at the Alaska World Affairs Council virtually to speak about the war on Ukraine, changing the shape of Arctic security. All of you who are joining us today, please do say hello to us in the chat room and let us know where you are in the world joining us. Our technical guru, Siobhan Choi, is here and she'll help you out if you're having any problems. Just let us know and we'll get you right back in. It's about 40 degrees and the sun is coming out in Anchorage today. And I hope the air is clean and the water is clean wherever you are in the world. Today's virtual program is part of our Evangeline Atwood Distinguished Speakers Series, and it will be followed by an in-person panel on cybersecurity Monday, May 6th at the 49th State Brewing Company. Today's program is also generously sponsored by the American Legion's Jack Henry Post 1 and in partnership with Alaska Public Media. The World Affairs Council of Alaska, we're part of 90 councils around the United States in the World Affairs Council of America network. We've been in Alaska longer than Alaska has been a state, and we welcome everyone who is here to join in the conversation at the end during our Q&A. If you're currently not a member, please do join today. Our website will let you do that, and you can support these unfiltered, nonpartisan, non-political programs like this, where you can directly hear from and ask questions directly to global thinkers and leaders. This program will be featuring a captivating conversation for about 30 minutes. It'll be followed by Q&A from all of you. As you think of a question you would like to ask, you can either type it into the Q&A button to let us know your question, and we'll try to get to many of those as possible. We'll also be bringing on some folks in person on screen to ask those questions. So raise your hand if you would like to be brought in on screen. We'll try to get through as many people as we can in the hour that we have today. And now I would like to hand the microphone over to Laura Sturdivant Dean. She's the adjutant for American Legion Post 1. She's also a board member of the Alaska World Affairs Council and a financial advisor at Merrill Lynch. Handing it over to you, Laura Sturdivant Dean.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. That was a great welcome. So welcome to everyone. American Legion Post 1 is super excited to support this. We've been looking at ways to get involved more in the community, and what better than to help the ambassador talk about how the Navy and how the military is really impacting the Arctic, and particularly with the Ukraine situation. So let me jump in with his bio. Be prepared to be amazed, because my jaw dropped when I read his bio. So Ambassador Kenneth Braithwaite is a businessman, diplomat, and a career U.S. naval officer. He is from Pennsylvania and was the first U.S. flag officer, meaning admiral, to serve as Secretary of the Navy. He previously served as a 31st U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway, where he significantly strengthened the relationship between the U.S. and Norway while bringing greater attention to the Arctic, something near and dear to us. Secretary Braithwaite graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1984 and later earned a master's degree in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania Fels School of Government. The secretary served as a naval aviator, flying anti-submarine patrol missions while tracking adversary submarines in the Pacific and Arctic regions. Later designated as a public affairs officer, he served aboard the aircraft carrier USS America, the CV-66, with additional duty assignments to Carrier Group 2, Strike Force US 6th Fleet, and Chief of Public Affairs at Naval Base Philadelphia. The ambassador left active duty in 1993, continuing his service in the U.S. Navy Reserves while he served as commanding officer of Navy Combat Camera Atlantic and standing up the Joint Public Affairs Support Element Joint Forces Command as its first commander. Ambassador Braithwaite deployed in 2003 for Operation Iraqi Freedom in support of naval operations to capture the port of Qasr, and later in 2005 to Pakistan as part of the Joint Task Force for Disaster Assistance. In his final Navy assignment, Ambassador Braithwaite served as the first Vice Chief of Information. Ambassador Braithwaite's civilian career has included executive leadership roles in healthcare and petroleum industries, as well as serving as a senior advisor to the U.S. Senator Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania. As Secretary of the Navy, Ambassador Braithwaite has led the Navy and Marine Corps through the COVID-19 pandemic, maintained readiness, enhanced global partnerships, and sustained a forward maritime posture while keeping personnel and their families safe. Under his leadership, the Navy and Marine Corps partnered with the U.S. Coast Guard to produce the first ever tri-service maritime strategy called Advantage at the Sea. He also expanded the department's preparation for the emerging Arctic theater, and modernized the department's force structure, championed the establishment of an Atlantic and First Fleet to protect the nation against the rise of the great power competition. Ambassador Braithwaite reinvigorated the Department of Navy's emphasis on the core values of honor, courage, and commitment. He also strengthened connections between the past and the future through the announcement of an investment in a new National Museum of the United States of the Navy. And historic ship name redesignations, such as the Constellation class frigate, named for the original 6 frigates, established the United States as a global maritime force in 1794. Also not included in his bio, but I'd like to note, is that while he was at the Naval Academy, he actually was on a ship outside of Lebanon during the bombings in 1983. So Ambassador, that was not cool, but historic to be there. So welcome, Ambassador. I can't wait to hear your thoughts and what you want to share with us.
There we go. Ambassador Braithwaite, on to you.
Okay, so technology, right? We're all a victim of it. So first and foremost, I'd like to apologize to you all because I'd much rather be there in person. I always believe that in-person engagements are much better than all this virtual stuff that we've been living under for the last couple of years. But as Lisa mentioned, my schedule changed in the last few moments, and over the last 48 hours, I have been between Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, and today I find myself in the great city of Nashville. But I made a promise that I will come back to Alaska, because as a young Navy pilot, I was stationed on the Aleutian Island, in the Aleutian Island chain on the island of Adak, Alaska. We used to have a naval air station there. And most recently, I traveled with my friend Dan Sullivan to come up and visit the people in Alaska. And I traveled extensively with him around the state, including going back to Adak and assessing it, whether or not we wanted to open up the naval air station there again with the rise of great power competition. But on all that, I digress, because today we're here to talk about the crisis in Ukraine and how that might impact the Arctic. It all starts back in, for me, Oslo, Norway, on a cold December night, December 10th, when an old soldier and a distinguished statesman rose to the dais of the Nobel Center to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What that old gentleman said that night is as relevant then and is relevant today. For the moment, the maintenance of peace in the present hazardous world situation does depend in a very large measure on military power, that and allied cohesion. Those were the words of then Secretary of State George Marshall, who had served as an aide to General Pershing during World War I on the front lines of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. And later, of course, was the Chief of Staff of all the United States Army forces during World War II, later to become both Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. What Marshall touched on that night is as relevant today in the situation that we face. Well, I had the high honor of serving as the U.S. Ambassador to Norway. I met with many people who questioned whether or not we still needed to maintain a NATO alliance. We had enjoyed a long period of peace. To maintain standing armies and navies, as we all know, is very expensive. And the concerns over Western European security had really eroded during the previous 70 years. But today, I would argue, and I'm sure most of you would agree, that NATO is more relevant than it's probably been at any time in its existence. NATO is the element that stands between the rest of Europe and what we have seen is a very aggressive Russia. But why Ukraine? And I've been asked this quite often. I mean, why would Russia feel compelled to invade Ukraine? Well, I'm a student of history, and I think as such, you have to look back at the history of Russia, the history of Ukraine, and understand why it would make sense to the Russians, and especially to Vladimir Putin, to launch this aggressive invasion. First and foremost, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire for many centuries. And the culture in Ukraine, as the culture in Russia, is very aligned. And people in Russia felt very strongly in their alliance with Ukraine, especially during the years of the Warsaw Pact. And with the increased pressure, or so as it was explained to the Russian people, of the encroachment of NATO. In the mid-1990s, when the wall came down, the President of the United States talked about, at that time, the expansion of NATO and welcomed many of the Eastern European nations who had shed off Soviet dominance to actually come and join NATO. And today, NATO has tripled in size in the last 15 years. We have member states that include former Warsaw Pact nations like Bulgaria and Romania, and of course the Baltic states. In 2012, as this had evolved, then the President of the United States gave a policy speech in Germany, and he talked about how Russia was no longer a world power, how Russia had in fact become a regional power and was no longer a threat to European security. Well, in 1993, when I left active duty, as Laura mentioned to you, as a US naval officer, I was prohibited from traveling to Russia. And I decided at that point that I wanted to leave the Navy as I transitioned into the Navy Reserve. But before I joined the Navy Reserve, I wanted to go to Russia. I wanted to see what the evil empire, as President Reagan talked about it during my youth, was really all about. Because I'd spent a lot of time tracking Soviet submarines in the waters there around Alaska, as well as in the waters of the Northern Atlantic. So I traveled there. And I found a people that were extremely proud of their culture, proud of their past. They were skeptical in that they knew that for whatever reason, Russia had been invaded many times over its history by the Swedes, by the French, and most recently by Nazi Germany. So they have this skepticism. And of course, as NATO was expanding and Putin came to power, all these dynamics came to play within the mindset of the Russian people as to the security of the Russian homeland. In polling that the Russian state has done in the last few years, over 68% of the Russian people believed that Ukraine was more Russian than it was Western European. And so understanding the dynamics at play and also believing in the military might of the Russian army, President Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine 8 weeks ago. But what he found was a nation that was committed to democracy, a nation that was extremely patriotic, and although had those cultural ties to Russia, saw themselves as independent. But in the events that led up to that, Russia has proven its interest in expanding its influence. If you recall what I mentioned about being a regional power versus a world power, in 2014, Russia, of course, invaded the Crimean Peninsula and annexed it as part of as a Russian territory. In addition to that, they moved on into eastern Ukraine through different pseudo-military engagements. I had the good fortune of teaching some of the Ukrainian students at the NATO school in Oberammergau, Germany, and the interest that Russia's had on the border of Ukraine is not something that started in February of 2022. And as this plays out, we think about the totality of what it means, to the rest of European security. As we've seen in the news reports, the rest of Europe is very concerned about this. Recently, both Finland and Sweden have talked about becoming members of NATO. Of course, Russia has threatened that if that were to occur, that perhaps they would have to be more aggressive in their actions to, again, stop that kind of expansion. And the elements that govern all that, when you think about the security situation and that of the interests of the people in Russia, you can understand why, through disinformation, the Russian state has been able to control the situation to the degree that they have. But you also have to think about the individual. I ask many audiences, and I'm always interested in hearing feedback to this. And of course, in this venue, we can't do that. But when I ask these questions, it tells a lot about who a person is to know where they come from. My father was a World War II veteran. He fought in the 4th Infantry Division. He was in the very first wave, the 3rd Landing Craft, to land on the beaches of Normandy. So with that kind of upbringing, it was very natural for me to want to serve our country and to be part of the military. When I ask audiences, who Vladimir Putin's father was, few people can tell me. And part of that's by design. It's part of the Russian state's effort at disinformation and confusion. But it's pretty widely known that Vladimir Putin was born illegitimately of a Russian soldier and a Georgian mother, who then, of course, was part of the Soviet Union. And he was brought to Russia and raised by relatives in St. Petersburg, where he felt very strongly about what the Soviet Union meant to him, both personally and professionally. As many of us know, he went on to become a KGB agent and worked in their security apparatus, and always with an eye towards geopolitical power. When the Soviet Union came apart, Vladimir Putin saw an opportunity to become much more politically involved and became a lieutenant to Boris Yeltsin, who was the president during those turbulent years of the 1990s. As Yeltsin became sick, Putin saw an opportunity to rise up and to grab power, which he did. And since that time in 2000, he has mentioned many times during many speeches about his intent to reestablish Russian influence around the world. It goes back to the speech that President Obama gave in 2012 and what I mentioned about Russian culture, that when Russia was referred to by the President of the United States as a regional power, that was a personal affront to a person like Vladimir Putin. Russia is the largest nation in the world, 1/6 of the world's landmass at one point in its Russian history. It has 1/3 of the world's untapped hydrocarbons, and it has the ability to project its power across the globe, whether its economy is suffering or not, just by the sheer size of the nation itself and the nations it borders. It has immense influence. 2005, Vladimir Putin gave a speech where he talked about the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, right? For you and me, that would probably be the Second World War. But for Vladimir Putin, it was the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And again, going back to what he identified with and what made him feel that he was part of something greater than self was that affiliation to a world power. So thinking through all of these things, and trying to assess this as much as we can, and talking with people both here in the United States and amongst our transatlantic partners, it's easy to recognize why Vladimir Putin would have decided to do what he did, thinking that this was something that would end up being concluded in a relatively short period of time. When you look at the size of the Russian army and what they were able to accrue on the border of Ukraine, they believed it was a matter of days before Ukraine would capitulate and come back into become part of Russia again. And when I used to ask audiences, why did Vladimir Putin believe that he could take the Crimean Peninsula? The easy answer is because he could. NATO was in a position where they couldn't respond. They didn't respond. We stood down and we let them annex Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine not being part of NATO does not, it means that Article 5 of mutual defense does not apply to Ukraine. But even with that, we've seen NATO respond in a way now to reinvigorate our commitment to our allies, to one another. And if there's a silver lining in any of this, it's the understanding of having that deterrent strength. Again, going back to what George Marshall said at the Nobel ceremony in 1952, that allied cohesion is very important during very difficult times. So what does that leave us today? Well, as I like to explain to audiences, I'm a military guy, and we have a term called a COA, it's course of action. And I believe that there are 4 COAs to how the situation in Ukraine plays out. And some of those are becoming less possible as time goes on. One, of course, is that Russia wins and they dominate Ukraine and they absorb Ukraine back into the Russian homeland. 2 is Ukraine stands its ground, fights, and eventually the Russians withdraw and give up the fight. But again, going back to the culture of Russia, and if you call what I talked about the Russian pride, and the importance of leaving a legacy, I think that would be very hard for Vladimir Putin to accept. Third is the one that I believe is most detrimental to the security of the free world, and that is that some misguided Russian commander makes a decision and strikes across the border into a neighboring NATO state, and that invokes Article 5 and brings NATO into the conflict, which would, of course, create World War III. And then fourth is the one that I believe has to be the answer, and that's a diplomatic solution. At this point, unfortunately, the diplomatic solutions are becoming more and more less palatable, in that no clear victory for either side would come out of any type of diplomatic resolution. For instance, Russia would have to be able to claim some type of success. So that would probably hinge on the eastern provinces, where Russia has now doubled down in their military efforts, and the Crimean Peninsula. So that would force the West to recognize Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, and as well as either reduce or eliminate the sanctions that we placed upon Russia in both 2014 and again, most recently here in 2022, when the current crisis began. There are many states in Western Europe that would look at that as appeasement, and that would not be something that would be favorable to a conclusion. However, my feeling is that short of engaging ourselves militarily, there are few options to stop Vladimir Putin from continuing the fight in Ukraine. Recent engagement that I had with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, told me that he felt very strongly that the longer that this crisis, this conflict went on, that the more difficult it would be to come to peaceful resolution through a diplomatic solution. And again, so the longer this goes on, the more likelihood is that one of the Western nations would be pulled in. And again, I believe that would be cataclysmic. So when we think about Ukraine, and there were many pundits that talked about, well, yes, Putin is flexing his muscle and he's showing his deterrent strength. Nobody expected him, few people did, to come across the border in late February of this year. But he has done that. And he's shown his ability to rein in interest groups within Russia through state disinformation efforts, and to garner strength from the Russian people in what Russia sees as a much different fight than the rest of us in the world have come to know this aggressive action to be. And being able to control that allows him to be able to continue to do what he's done. So why wouldn't that mean that he could do this somewhere else? Well, he could. And I think if he would have been as successful at the very beginning of this, and had seen this through to conclusion within that first week period, that he would be looking at the other states who are non-NATO members, who are former Warsaw Pact members, to begin to move aggressively towards them as well. So what does that mean for the Arctic, which is what we're here to talk about? Well, when you think about the Arctic and its scale, and you think about Russia's identity as an Arctic state, Russia believes very strongly that their influence in the Arctic is second to none, and therefore their claim to the Arctic is second to none. As we saw several years ago, the Russians made an effort to go to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean at the very North Pole and plant a Russian flag there, claiming the North Pole as their territory. And there have been continued efforts of the Russians to expand their influence militarily in the high north. While I served as ambassador, they remilitarized the Kola Peninsula. They began to deploy more of their ballistic missile capable submarines into their northern fleet, and began to act very overtly in both the Barents and the Norwegian seas. They've conducted some of the largest exercises that the Russian military has done since the end of the Cold War, and they continue to accelerate those efforts. For Russia, security in the Arctic is ever more important to them than it is to almost any other Arctic nation. Nearly 25% of their GDP comes from their resources in the Arctic. They have, of course, a border on the Arctic, second to none. And they've entered into different private sector efforts, especially when it comes to liquefied natural gas. They've joined with the Chinese on the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia to build a large LNG facility. They also have looked to the Arctic as a new sea route, an ability to move commerce from one side of the world to the other. And then, of course, that's brought interest from the Chinese as well. When you look at the Northern Sea Route, which goes across the top of Russia, it reduces the transit time by more than half of what it would take to move product from one side of the world to the other. And where today 90% of all trade is done by sea, you can imagine the significance of the Northern Sea Route. And as I understand, talking to economists, that percentage of trade is going to double in the next 10 years. So while I was Secretary of the Navy, after having been ambassador, having been a former Navy pilot, flying through the Arctic, throughout the Arctic, both there in Alaska, as well as in the North Atlantic, recognized the Arctic was changing. Whether you have one mindset or the other on global warming, the fact of the matter is the seas are opening up in the high north in a way that has been unprecedented in world history. And so we commissioned a study to look at a blue Arctic. And what would that mean for not only the United States, but specifically for us, the United States Navy. As many of you know, in Alaska, we have a limited presence. We have a continuous presence. I'd like to see to people, just because you don't see the United States Navy in the Arctic doesn't mean that we're there. I think you know what I mean by that. But again, anytime that you're able to put forces to sea and you create a deterrent force, that's by the presence of what you see, not by what you believe or think. So it is very important to have a footprint that you can ensure that your interests are known and security is maintained. To this point, the Arctic has been relatively free of conflict. But as the Arctic begins to open up and more of those rich resources that I talked about, whether it's the rare earth minerals or the hydrocarbons or fishing stocks, tensions are going to rise in the Arctic. Also being a naval strategist, and I think about the choke points around the world, we saw last year what it meant to shut down the Suez Canal. One great choke point is a strait that I spend a lot of time flying over, and that's the Bering Strait right there in your backyard. And so what would Russia's or China's design be to control these straits, limit our ability to maintain an open sea lanes of communication? Dan Sullivan and I shared a vision for a more pronounced naval presence, U.S. naval presence, so that, again, we could maintain the security in a region that has been secure. I think we're going to see more pressure in the high north. Whether or not the Ukrainian conflict spills over into the Arctic, I'm no wizard. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't believe we will see war in the Arctic from the current Ukrainian conflict. I do believe that diplomacy will be the outcome at the end of the day. I don't think it will be a palatable outcome for either side, but I believe that sane minds will prevail at the end of the day, and the Ukrainians will maintain their sovereignty. Russia will claim some more territorial gains, but it should be a notice to us that unless we make the investments now that will ensure the ability to maintain peace in the future, that we're putting ourselves at great risk. Because today we don't have that continual presence. One thing we do have is great allies, which sets us apart from a lot of other nations. When you look at Russia, Russia doesn't have a lot of allies to leverage off of and create that force multiplier. We do. The Norwegians have been that sentinel in the high north for us on the northern flank of NATO. But of course, their interests in the Arctic are the Atlantic, not the Pacific. And when we look to the Pacific in your backyard, it's only us, the United States and Canada. The Canadians have been phenomenal allies. I believe will continue to be phenomenal allies. But again, they are operating under reduced defense spending and a belief that the United States will, provide the security that's required to keep the Arctic secure. So I think it all comes back to my hero, George Marshall, and what he said. He was asked after he gave the speech that night, General, if you were to look into the future, how would we ensure victory if there ever did occur a third world war? And Marshall, being the brilliant man that he was, said the only way that we could ensure victory in World War III was to prevent that war from ever happening. And the only way we are able to do that is by military strength and deterrence. And so today, as we look to Europe for the conflict that has created such pain and suffering, and all of us to see this on a daily basis, we must be prepared for any possibility that spillover from that could impact us as it has the Ukrainian people. And I believe that comes through a strong military. I believe that the military is your insurance policy. As I had mentioned many times while in Europe to many European military leaders, it's one thing to have homeowners insurance. And we have that to ensure that if something did occur, that we would have the means to build back our homes. For us as nation states, there's no guarantee of universal education or universal health care, for that matter, without the ability to maintain our sovereignty and our way of life. And as General Marshall said, that only comes by a deterrent force that would make another nation think twice about being overt in its actions towards us. So with that, I've talked a little over 30-some minutes here, and I learned from my mother a long time ago that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth to listen twice as much as we speak. So I'll turn it back over to Lisa, and I'm happy to take your questions. And again, I apologize for not being there with you in person. I'll try to make it up to you next time.
Ambassador Braithwaite, is so wonderful to have you here with us virtually, and the questions are coming in. I'm going to bring people on the screen to ask them in person. I have Fran Ulmer coming up here soon, but I want to follow up with a question that's come through here on what you're talking about with building up presence in the Arctic, that the Navy is there. And this question is about Alaska, and Alaska has a large Air Force and Army bases, along with a lot of troops and a lot of equipment. However, the US Navy is not in Alaska. Can you
Right.
talk a little bit about that? Was that part of your discussions with Senator Sullivan?
It was. So again, having had the privilege of being stationed in Alaska as a Navy pilot, you know, the situation has changed greatly in Alaska and is going to continue to change. The one thing that's different, of course, between the high north in the Atlantic and the high north in the Pacific is a thing called the Gulf Stream. So as you know, Lisa, the waters around Tromsø and up in Svalbard are open pretty much 365. That's not the same situation in the high northern Pacific on the coast of Alaska. But I believe that it's only a matter of years that before that's going to change. As such, we have some time now, but we need to begin to prepare. Alaska is becoming even more of a maritime nation as the Arctic Sea opens up. And it is, you know, a responsibility of the United States Navy to ensure security from a maritime perspective. So today we've been able to do that with our submarine force, as I mentioned. You know, that's part of the Navy that people don't see floating around in the Arctic and a lot of the oceans of the world. They are there. They're there right now as I'm making this speech. We have a continual presence in the Arctic. But again, that's not a deterrent. That's not a deterrent presence in that it is not a presence that is seen. It is one that is understood. But again, until you actually create the recognition of having that deterrent force, you know, perception is different than reality. So the United States Navy is going to have to think through all the challenges around the globe. And like any other organization, there's only so many resources to go around. But the Arctic ties together 75% of the world's population. And as it becomes more navigable and truly does become that blue Arctic, it's going to be the Navy that has to have that presence. I think we have a great Coast Guard. I'm very close to Commandant Schultz. In fact, he's invited me to come to Washington to talk about some of these same interests. But when you think about the different services, as you mentioned, the Air Force and the Army and the Coast Guard are all there in a 365 presence. The United States Navy, as far as having the actual physical bases in Alaska, does not have that. And I think that needs to change.
Okay, and over to you, Fran Ulmer.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your public service and for giving us insight today into sort of the Russian mentality and some of the possible outcomes, none of which sound particularly viable, doable, or what we would choose if we could. I want to dig into your diplomatic expertise for a moment. As you probably know, the Arctic Council has for many years, over 26, been the glue, so to speak, that has kept the Arctic family working together through science and diplomacy and working groups. And it's really been a powerful force for building mutual understanding and doing work together that has been both individually beneficial and mutually beneficial. So about 3 weeks ago, there was a huge gathering here in Anchorage, the Arctic Encounters, with about 600 people who know a lot about Arctic diplomacy, business, science, geopolitics, all discussing sort of where are we at and how might the Russian invasion of Ukraine affect not only the Arctic Council, but the Arctic 7, that is our ability as Arctic nations without Russia to actually move forward on some of our common agenda. So I would just like to dig in a little bit on that question with you. if the Arctic Seven go forward, and as you may know, Norway will take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council after Russia completes its chairmanship, which for all practical purposes has been effectively suspended. Do you think the Arctic Seven can go forward in a meaningful way without Russia? Do you think Russia will react to that by basically leaving the Arctic Council officially? So please talk to me about that.
Yeah, no, it's a terrible, I mean, so there are so many other elements to Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine that most of us are not focused on. And Fran, Arctic Council is one of those that most Americans, as you know, being an Alaskan, I would say this all the time, you know, it's easy for Norway to identify itself as an Arctic nation, or Russia, for instance. You know, most people in the United States, if I walked out here in the streets of Nashville and asked people who the 7 members of you know, the Arctic Council were, nobody would ever say the United States. A few people would. I shouldn't say everybody, but, you know, few people recognize you know, our membership on the Arctic Council and what that means. And moreover, the success over the last 25 plus years of how the Arctic Council has managed the issues that are of concern in the Arctic to all of us, whether it's climate change or natural resources or search and rescue, whatever it's been. It has really done a fantastic job. And when I went to Norway, you know, being a huge proponent of the Arctic Council and trying to even empower the Arctic Council more, I saw more and more of that falling away. And a lot of that has to do with Russia's aggressive behavior at remilitarizing the Arctic. I mean, they have done an incredible job of opening up bases in very short periods of time, of bringing forces there that are unprecedented since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And all that changes the dynamic, the force structure of balancing the element of power and influence in the Arctic, which is why I'm such a huge proponent of having a presence of the United States Navy. And unfortunately, we've proven throughout world history that few governing bodies that don't have a military component to stand up and back that up from a deterrent, a posture of deterrent strength, at the end of the day, they fall apart. And that's my fear now with the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council becomes irrelevant if Russia withdraws. You know, that was one of the few venues where we could meet with, you know, our Russian counterparts and have that dialogue, the issues of concern in the Arctic. You know, now with their chairmanship in tatters and pretty much everybody turning them back on Russia, you know, what are Russia's options? I feel pretty strongly that, you know, until this crisis is resolved one way or the other, you know, Russia's going to not be, you know, a welcome member of an Arctic Council that, you know, seeks to create peace in one place in the world. At the same time, this nation is creating such destruction and violation of humanity in another space. So again, I think the Arctic Council today is on hold. As I say in the US Senate, we're going to table that, which is extremely unfortunate because all the pressing issues, all the things that need to be addressed in the Arctic, they continue to move along with time, and especially global warming. So I don't see a rosy picture when it comes to the Arctic Council. And I think that nations are going to have to revisit it in a way. One thing that we do have is all the other nations who are part of the Arctic Council. Most of them are members of NATO. Most of them are rule of law and democratically oriented nations. I think that gives us the hope because, again, I go back to the importance of allied cohesion, as General Marshall talked about. That is a differential between us and the more autocratic nations in the world. So thank you, Fran. That's a great question. Wish I had a better answer.
Well, to follow up on that, do you think some of the conversations will still be happening? For example, conversations around science, technology, cooperation, fishing?
Yes, I do, but I don't believe it'll be in the way of the formalized manner in which the Arctic Council was met in the past. And I forget the actual, I knew the number the other day, and my apologies to you that I, you know, it's like 2,000 some kilometers of a border that Russia has, I think it maybe even 2,000 miles, I forget, so don't quote me on the number, but it's an immense amount of land mass that Russia has in the Arctic. The only other nation that comes close is Canada. And so when you think about the Canadian high north as compared to the Russian high north, the Russian high north is much more viable space in which to live in to thrive. That's not the same in the high north of Canada. So again, I learned this study at the Naval War College, The Art of War in Sun Tzu. I mean, part of managing the interests of your nation is actually having a presence in that territory. And short of our presence in Alaska, the U.S. doesn't have a consistent presence in the Arctic, and we even in Alaska have a limited one. Russia has a pretty robust presence in the Arctic, and so I think that as they continue to build up, their military capabilities in the high north, that they're going to begin to, just exactly like they did in Ukraine, they're going to flex that muscle when they feel they've got the advantage to do what they want to do, or at least test us. And I think the testing would come, of course, post-Ukraine. I don't think they would do it now. There'd be too much at risk for them. But once they get past this situation, they're going to be looking for ways that they can exercise their muscle to have that influence. Is an interesting point. Vladimir Putin's desire coming out of the speech in Berlin in 2012 has been to be relevant and respected on the world stage. He wants Russia to be recognized as a world power. And as my old boss, Jim Mattis, began to put together in the National Defense Strategy of 2018, that recognition of new great power competition is ever so important for the United States and all of our allies to understand that it's a different world today in 2022 than it was when the Soviet Union came apart in the early 1990s. And we don't have that dominant position to be able to have complete and unfettered influence around the globe. Today, we have to take in consideration what we're seeing here in Ukraine with Russia, but also Chinese influence. That's a whole nother topic that we can talk about, and how the Chinese have inserted themselves in the Arctic as a near Arctic state. Of course, Lisa, as you and I have talked about, what's the definition of a near Arctic nation? The Congo could claim itself as a near Arctic nation, for that matter, under the Chinese definition. But be that as it may, it's presence that matters. And the Chinese have a great presence in the Arctic, second only to the Russians when it comes to their fishing interests. So again, becomes very problematic. The world's changing.
I hope we do get to that, because we do have some questions about that. But I want to follow up just what you were talking about, actually, from your strategy technician expertise. This question is, do you think the reports of Russian antiquated equipment and freshly conscripted soldiers in Ukraine, along with their to-date inability to successfully take control, indicates weakness within the Russian military or some other strategic tactic at play going on?
Wow, that's a great question. And whoever asked me that question, thank you for that, because that's the other thing that I didn't tell you that I recognized when I went to Russia in 1993. So I talked about culture. I'm a big person on culture. I think culture defines every organization, the success of that organization, and the success of a nation. The culture of America is really, really great. That's why we've been such a successful nation, but I digress. Skepticism, remember I talked about that. The Russians have been invaded many times and have had to defend themselves to the very doorstep. So that gives them a skeptical outlook on other nations' interests in Russia. But the other thing that I took away while I was there was the infrastructure of Russia was just terrible. I remember the hotel I stayed in. It was a very nice hotel that was, terrible in Western standards. Rotary dial phones, their vehicles, their buses, their trucks were just, very bad quality. And I had read some of that as some of the naval intelligence reports when I was a pilot, that the Russian Navy had a great first strike capability, but sustainable operations would be something that it would struggle with. Well, I think here, 30, 40 years later, that's what we're seeing play out. I believe that Russian equipment is not at the level of what we would consider, fully capable to meet its military interests. And I believe that carries over to their Navy. I mean, we saw the cruiser Moskva, go to the bottom, hit by 2 Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles, which is extremely simple, sure to ship technology that came out of Russian missile with very short, limited range. The range of that missile is 19 miles. And for the Russians to put their vessel in those littorals and think that they had a secure space to operate in, again, shows the either lack of intelligence or the belief that their systems could stand up to what the Ukrainians could use against them. We've seen the long lines of tanks that have, just stopped in their tracks. Conscripts. One thing the Russian military doesn't have that we have in the U.S. military and other militaries around the nation that don't have begun to embrace this, including the Norwegian military, is a professional enlisted class of leadership. So what I'm talking about there are the command sergeant majors, the master chief petty officers, the first sergeants, the people who have committed themselves as non-officers, as the technical part of military capability. The Russians don't possess that with their military. And short of having that professional class of military, soldier, sailor, airman, marine, you really don't have the professionalized force that another nation possesses, like the United States, that we would be able to utilize in any kind of similar conflict. So yes, I think all that, the conscripts, this is something that I found in a briefing by some of the people inside the Pentagon, that the Russian soldiers were told on the eve of the invasion that they were going to be welcomed by the Ukrainian people as returning victors, as liberators, that the Ukrainian people were so desirous of having Russia back in Ukraine to rule Ukraine that the soldiers were going to, be met by roses and kissing, by the citizens of Ukraine. And many of the soldiers brought their dress uniforms with them, thinking that was the reception they were going to get. And what a rude awakening they had.
Okay,
Lisa?
I'm right here. I'm going to bring on another person to ask a question in person, Whitney Wygren. And let's see if this comes right through. Otherwise, there you are. Good to see you. Please go ahead. If you just turn on yourself, you're on mute right at this moment.
Oh, now can you hear me? Wonderful. Really appreciate your panel today. Given the strategic ties between China and Russia, could you provide your perspective if the Sino-Russia Arctic military cooperation, specifically the joint exercises, will be negatively impacted by the Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, that's another interesting spillover from this, Whitney, is the fact that, China is a very strategic state, and China always takes the long view. They have throughout their history. One of the things we were very concerned about when Russia crossed the border into Ukraine was that Xi Jinping would use this as an opportunity to cross the straits in Taiwan and invade Taiwan, the Republic of China. And when that didn't happen, following the press conference, if you remember on the eve of the Olympics, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin got together and reaffirmed their commitment to one another as to their territorial aims. And I remember Jim Mattis. I worked for General Mattis when I was a Navy captain. He came to visit me when I was ambassador in Oslo while he was Secretary of Defense. And he said, the worst thing for the security of the Western world, not only the United States, is if China and Russia lash up in any way to create that kind of alliance. I think what's happened is the Chinese are extremely, again, strategic, and they have watched how the world has been, shocked, appalled by Russian aggression, and how the media has been able to report that and reflect, just how terrible those images coming out of Ukraine have been to reflect back so poorly upon Russia. So Xi Jinping is not somebody who wants to be associated with those type of efforts when most of the economic success of China has been because of access to Western markets. And so I think if, again, there's a silver lining in what's happened in Ukraine, it's that it's going to make China think twice about its territorial aims of gaining Taiwan back under Chinese rule, as well as to understand that any type of an alliance with Russia would be problematic to China's interests, with the rest of the world. And, it doesn't mean that China and Russia won't continue to do business. I think they will. That's one of the only outs that Vladimir Putin has, is having access to the Chinese market to be able to ship oil and gas in that direction. So again, it'll be interesting to watch that play out, but I think it's going to tap things down a little bit in a way that is going to be welcomed by everyone. I mean, most Americans miss the fact that for the first time in the history of the world, the Russian and Chinese Navy came together in a fleet exercise and sailed between two of the home islands, Hokkaido and Honshu, in the Japan, right on the edge of the territorial rights that Japan would have, but again, to flex their muscle and to create the perception that they were working together. So I think all that's going to be tapped down for a while. It was a great question, Whitney. Thank you.
Here's another good one. So the US and most other countries have cut numerous ties with Russia. In Alaska, a dozen communities established sister city relationships with Russian cities during the heyday of good relations in the 80s and the 90s. Do you think such people-to-people ties should be cut to send a strong message, or put on hold for that day when Putin no longer reigns over Russia?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question. And so my travels to Russia, again, I was there for nearly a month. I found the Russian people to be beautiful people. The music star Sting talks about that in one of his songs. The Russians love their children too. And I believe in that, right? That the Russian people themselves would be appalled if they knew what the real story was with their forces in Ukraine. And I've been asked about that, as bodies begin to go back to Russia, what will, Russian families think? And I think as long as Putin is able to control, state-directed media, that they'll continue to think that they're fighting some patriotic war and their soldiers are coming back because, they're serving Mother Russia. People to people is what we need to double down on now more than ever. That's the only way that we can create a peaceful world, is in creating open dialogue. And the minute that you begin communicating, a minute that you cease communicating, is the moment that you begin setting up a perception that is less than reality, that you believe something that isn't necessarily true because you're not engaged. And after we put the sanctions on Russia in 2014 and NATO pulled farther away from Russia, the backside to that, the bad outcome was that we began to both think things that were more Cold War reflective of what our intent was, rather than actually having a conversation. It's one of the great advantages of having been the U.S. ambassador to Norway, that the Norwegian military continued to keep that open channel of communication. And they pushed back on NATO because NATO wanted to shut down all communications with the Russian military. But the Norwegians held strong to that because they share a 120-mile border, and they felt it imperative to keep peace, in the Arctic. And I would agree. So we have got to find some way back. And in that question of sister cities and having dialogue with people, and thankfully the internet does allow us to communicate in a way that, even though governments can try to restrict that, there's still ways that we can get our messages through to people around the world to help educate them to the real truth. And I think a lot of that would come by the efforts of Alaskans who are trying to communicate, with their brothers and sisters across the Bering Straits.
I'm going to squeeze in one more in our last minute here on that, hoping that it's as rosy and positive as you talk with the people to people. And this question is, do you think that the Ukrainian situation will deteriorate into a North Korea scenario, where a stalemated line of conflict in eastern Ukraine will exist in perpetuity?
Yeah, it's another very good question. You got great members there of the World Affairs Council, very deep thinkers. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that Vladimir Putin can allow that to happen. He's, again, going back to Russian pride and the legacy of Russian leaders. He's got to, the great analogy I use here is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, and this is what I was at the very beginning, and maybe this is still an element of what Putin's rationale was. I mean, I don't underestimate the fact that Nikita Khrushchev had no real interest in defending Cuba. He had the interest in collecting a card in his poker hand that would give him leverage over the United States so that he would create something. As an entrepreneur, as a businessman, I think about this all the time. How do you create value that then you can use to negotiate and trade with that helps you in your position to accrue more value towards your investors, your shareholders? And in this case, nation state to nation state, we saw Trump try to do some of this in the Middle East, create value out of things that nobody else had thought about from a perspective of business rather than intergovernmental engagement. So Nikita Khrushchev put the missiles in Cuba for one reason, and that was to have the ability to trade, removing my missiles from Cuba, with you, Mr. President, John F. Kennedy, removing your missiles from Turkey. And in doing that, right, Russia, Khrushchev was able to turn back to the Russian people and say, see, what I was able to do is help protect Mother Russia from a threat on our southern border from missiles that were pointed at us in Turkey. Most Americans back in the Cuban Missile Crisis days had no idea that we had missiles in Turkey. And they had no idea that that was the overriding objective of Nikita Khrushchev, but John F. Kennedy did. And Kennedy said, I'd rather get those missiles out of Cuba so they're not 90 miles off our coast pointed at us. For the same reason Nikita Khrushchev wanted those missiles out of Turkey. So Vladimir Putin, in his efforts to invade Ukraine, may have all along wanted to validate, from a Western perspective, his annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. Because for the last 7 years, now 8 years, the Russians have been suffering with some of the sanctions that we layered on them after that 2014 invasion. And if you know the history of the Crimean Peninsula, it was that same guy, Nikita Khrushchev, who actually, it was Russian territory. He gave it to the Ukrainians as a gift so they would be able to have a wider presence on the Black Sea in 1954. So historically, the Crimean had been part of Russia. And Putin, feeling that after Ukraine became independent and Ukraine starts to show interest in becoming part of NATO, it became a threat to him to allow the Crimean Peninsula to still be part of Ukraine, which is why he annexed it. And as I said earlier, why did he do that? Because he could. Nobody stood up to him. And he saw NATO eroding. And I think that was part of his calculus too, is, I don't know if NATO is going to stand up to me here. And what we've proven, right, is all those Western nations that were cashing in a bigger peace dividend than we did during the 90s by not rebuilding their military after the wall came down are now scrambling to catch up. I mean, the Germans alone have redirected an immense amount of their budget to rebuild a military that's 1980s technology. So again, Putin has overplayed that card. He's got to try to get out of this in some way that allows him to save face, that he can go back to the Russian people and claim victory. And again, I would argue this, I've said this publicly, I know you're recording me here, but I think that comes with the annexation of Crimea and the West validating that, as well as those eastern provinces of Ukraine, which the separatists have been fighting there since 2014. There's such unrest. It's it's a very difficult space for President Zelensky to manage, and it gives a land bridge for Russia to be able to get to the Crimean. Although that would be a hard outcome for a lot of Western European nations to accept, I see, few other options. Because as this war continues to carry out, more people suffer. and more risk to the rest of the nations surrounding Ukraine as they potentially could be dragged into this conflict. I will tell you this: the Poles are literally leaning in to join the fight if they could, because they realize they're probably next. Remember, Poland was part of the Soviet Empire as well. So the Poles fought for their independence after World War I, became an independent state, and then were traded off after World War II. So they have a lot at stake in this conflict. And, you know, they're part of NATO. So, of course, Article 5 would apply to any overt action that Russia would take against Poland. Again, it becomes a very complex situation that becomes more and more difficult to manage the longer it goes on, which is why we in the West have a vested interest to be engaged and to engage as quickly as possible. And I do believe that takes American leadership. One thing I learned as a U.S. ambassador is the influence of America. Most Americans, I'm a middle-class kid. I grew up in a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath little Cape Cod house in Michigan. And my parents didn't go to college. But I was brought up believing in the American dream, that if I worked hard enough, I could become, you know, whatever America was willing to allow me to become. And I've had an incredible career. And I get to be a U.S. ambassador, where somebody from where I grew up wouldn't get to be an American ambassador. But what I realized in that role is that America is first amongst equals. And what I mean by that is American influence is unbelievable when it comes to other nations of the world. They know what goes on in America every day. Their news reports on us almost more than it reports on the events that happen in their nations. And as I was told before I left the State Department to go to Oslo, the beginning of my time as an ambassador, that the influence that the American ambassador would have would be second only to, for me, a monarch, since King Harald is the King of Norway, and the Prime Minister. But in the pecking order, that I would be able to call on anyone at any time because of the stature of the United States of America. So when the president says something, the world listens to that. And right now we need to be extremely mindful of what our role is to achieve peace. And we can't defer that to the Turkish president, Erdogan, who's out there trying to, you know, show that, you know, he's a peacemaker, which there are many other, you know, examples that are pointing in the opposite direction. But be that as it may, the United States has a role here, and we have an important role to step up as a leader on the world stage and make those hard decisions, to lead nations to embrace a way out of this. And again, a way out of a crisis like this is never straightforward. To Fran's point, it's not going to be a win-win, or not going to be, everybody is not going to get a full bowl of frosted flakes when this is all done. We're going to all have to give up something in order to get to a point to create a secure peace in Europe again. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to be extremely vigilant to protect that peace. The reason why we're here today is because we cashed in on that great peace dividend, never thinking that would ever be a major challenge to peace and security across Europe. And what we have woken up to in the last 8 weeks is completely opposite, that history has a very wicked way of repeating itself and coming back and biting us in the tail when we expect it least. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kenneth Braithwaite. It is so great to see you again, not in person this time, but virtually. I really look forward to seeing you again in person and bringing you to Alaska. We have had King Harald of Norway in 2015 for the Alaska World Affairs
He's a great
Council.
man. He's a great man.
You're next on our list, and we look forward to you coming. So thank you very much for joining us here. And I hope to see everyone who's joined us here in person in Anchorage Friday, May 6th, for our noon program with a panel discussion program with thoughtful leaders about the future of cybersecurity. Is that our next biggest threat? Ensuring security and building resilience. We really appreciate your support. We appreciate any donations through our website, any amount, and look forward to seeing you in person and in our future virtual programs. We want to thank the Atwood Foundation, the American Legion's Jack Henry Post #1, Alaska Public Media, and of course, Ambassador Kenneth Braithwaite. And thank you, all of our attendees, for joining us today. I hope to see you again soon, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Ambassador Braithwaite.
All right, God bless you all. Bye now.